Under the merciless New Mexico sun, Calder Wyatt rode with the slow, steady rhythm of a man who knew the land and expected nothing from it. Dust plumed from the hooves of his dun mare, a fine powder that settled on a world cracked and thirsty. He'd been trailing a lost heifer since dawn, the prints now little more than whispers in the baked earth. The silence out here was a kind of church, broken only by the creak of worn leather and the high, lonely cry of a hawk circling in the vast, indifferent blue. Calder preferred it this way, alone, quiet. But then a sound, so faint it might have been the wind teasing a thorny branch, snagged his attention. It was a breath that had forgotten how to breathe, a hitch in the world's rhythm. He drew his mare to a halt, head tilted, every nerve listening. It came again. A whimper, thin and sharp as a thread stretched to its breaking point. He swung down from the saddle, tying the reins to the skeletal limb of a dead juniper. Rifle in hand, he moved through the scrub and boulders, his boots making no sound on the soft dirt. He found her in a small clearing, beneath the gnarled branches of an ancient cottonwood. She was hanging by her wrists, arms stretched taut above her head, her body limp and surrendered. Her toes skimmed the dirt, a cruel parody of standing. Her skin was the color of the sun-scorched earth, her long black hair matted with sweat and blood. A shallow, erratic flutter in her chest was the only sign she was alive. Calder's gaze snapped upward to a crude wooden sign nailed to the trunk above her head. The words were scrawled in thick red paint, angry and jagged. "White man don't forgive." He took an involuntary step back, a bitter taste rising in his throat. The air grew heavy, a warning, a message, a curse. He scanned the surrounding ridges, the silent rocks. Nothing moved, just the wind, brushing through dead leaves with a sound like whispering. His hand went to the hilt of the knife on his belt. "Christ," he muttered, the words swallowed by the heat. "What in God's name did they do to you?" The girl stirred, a barely perceptible motion. Her head lolled, and he saw the raw, chafed flesh where the rope bit into her wrists. He swallowed, his throat dry. "Can you hear me?" he asked, his voice a hoarse rasp. No response. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said, softer this time, as if trying to convince himself. His boots crunched on the gravel as he stepped closer. He could see her face now, young, perhaps 18, with the high cheekbones and strong jaw of her people. Her cheeks were hollowed by thirst, a line of dried blood tracing her lip. He reached up, his fingers brushing against the rope. It was twisted mesquite fiber, coarse and cruel. Whoever tied it meant for her to suffer long before she died. He drew his knife. His hand, usually so steady, trembled slightly. That sign screamed at him, echoing accusations he'd spent a lifetime trying to outride. For a moment, it made him one of them. It made him hesitate. But then she groaned, a low, broken sound that severed his doubt. "I ain't all of 'em," he whispered, and slid the blade against the taut fibers. "I ain't that." With a single, firm slice, the rope gave way. She fell, and he lunged forward, catching her just before she hit the ground. Her body was light, burning with fever, and she felt fragile in his arms, as if her bones had turned to dust. Her eyes fluttered open, dark, frightened, and unfocused. Calder eased her down, kneeling in the dirt beside her. He uncorked his canteen, poured water onto a neckerchief, and gently dabbed her cracked lips. "Easy now," he murmured. You're safe. For the moment, at least. She blinked, her gaze still lost. But then her fingers twitched, clutching weakly at his sleeve. He glanced one last time at the sign on the tree, then back at her face. He shrugged off his canvas coat and draped it over her trembling shoulders. You got a name? He asked gently. Nothing. All right, he sighed. Guess we'll have to find you one. He stood, lifting her with a grunt of effort, cradling her like something precious and not yet broken. For now, you're with me. And with that, Calder Wyatt turned his back on the tree and stepped back into the wilderness, carrying a girl marked for death and a secret heavy enough to hang a man. The sun was a bleeding wound on the horizon by the time Calder reached his ranch, a modest outpost clinging to the edge of a desert, too stubborn to forget its history of violence. A single windmill spun with a weary creak, and the old barn sagged as if in mourning. The house was just one room and a loft, its roof patched with scavenged sheet metal, but it stood as solid and honest as the man who'd built it. He eased the girl from the saddle and carried her inside. She was deep in a fever, her head pressed against his chest, her breath like dry leaves skittering across a stone floor. He laid her on his cot, carefully unwrapping the coat. Her eyes opened for a moment, wide and distant, but they followed his movements. By the flicker of a single lantern, he poured water into a basin. He knelt beside the cot. Her legs were a map of bruises and scrapes, one ankle swollen and dark. The rope burns on her wrists looked like brands. I ain't gonna hurt you, he said. The words meant more to fill the silence than to expect a reply. Just gonna clean you up a bit. He dipped a clean cloth in the water, wrung it out, and then, with a reverence he hadn't felt in years, he gently took her foot and placed it in the basin. She flinched, a tiny, reflexive tremor. He paused, waiting. When she didn't pull away, he began to wash away the grime and dried blood, his touch careful, his movements precise. The water turned murky red and brown. He worked in silence, feeling her gaze on him, a weight as real as a hand on his shoulder. Her lips parted once as if to speak, but only a sigh escaped. Reckon you don't talk much, he murmured, not unkindly. That's all right. Silence is a sight better than most things people have to say. He finished with her feet, wrapping them in clean strips of linen before setting them gently on a folded blanket. You remind me of a river I used to camp near, he said quietly, his voice low. Dry most of the year, looked dead, but after the rains, it ran fast and deep. Had a proper name, but the locals called it Quiet Snake. Can't say why. It was just quiet. He looked at her then, truly looked, studying the sharp lines of her cheekbones, the dark lashes thick with dust. She was too young for this kind of suffering, yet there was an ancient stillness in her eyes, a look that didn't flinch from pain, but simply waited for it to pass. I'll call you Lena, he said softly. Just for now. You look like a Lena. Quiet, but strong. She blinked once, a slow, deliberate motion. No protest. No agreement. Just breath. Calder stood and tucked a heavy wool blanket around her shoulders. There's beans on the stove if you get hungry. He grabbed his bedroll and headed for the door. He'd sleep in the barn, give her the house. It wasn't right for her to wake to a stranger's face. Not after what she'd endured. Before he stepped out into the cooling night, he looked back. Her eyes were closed, her lips no longer trembling. The basin sat by the cot, its water stained with the evidence of what had been done to her. He carried it outside and emptied it onto the thirsty earth, watching the ground drink it down without a trace. Inside, Lena dreamed of fire and ropes and rough, gentle hands that washed the hurt away without asking for a name. The days that followed fell into the slow, predictable rhythm of desert life. Yet the silence in the small house was different now. Charged, expectant. Lena, as he continued to call her, ate the food he left, though never much. She moved with the fluid caution of a wild thing, her eyes always scanning, her body held tight, as if expecting a blow. She never spoke. But sometimes, when she thought he wasn't looking, he would catch her watching him. Calder took to sleeping in the barn, his rifle propped against the wall beside him. He told himself it was to give her space, but the truth was more tangled. He was afraid. Not of her, but of what she brought with her. That sign still burned in his memory. White man don't forgive. Whoever wrote it had left her to die a slow, public death. They might not take kindly to her being alive. It was on the third morning that he saw it. A single boot print near the barn, smaller than his own, and fresh. He squatted, studying the crisp impression in the hard-packed dirt. The heel was military issue. Cavalry, no more than a few hours old. He rose slowly, his gaze sweeping the silent ridgeline. Nothing but heat, shimmer, and sage. Inside, Lena was by the window, a still silhouette against the morning light. Her body tensed when he entered, but she didn't turn. "You see anyone?" he asked. She said nothing, just pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "I think we might have company," Calder murmured, more to himself than to her. That evening, he sat on the porch steps as darkness fell, his rifle resting across his knees. The wind died down, and the coyotes began their nightly sermon. He could hear Lena inside, pacing the floorboards in slow, deliberate circles. The rider appeared around midday, a lone figure materializing from the heat haze, dust curled from the hooves of a chestnut horse. The man wore the blue and gold of the U.S. cavalry, his hat pulled low over a face rough with stubble. Calder stepped off the porch, his hand resting casually near the colt on his hip. The soldier reined in, his horse dancing nervously. "You Calder Wyatt?" "Depends who's asking." "Lieutenant Graham. We're tracking a fugitive." The lieutenant pulled a folded notice from his coat and handed it down. "Seen this one?" Calder took the paper, his face impassive, though he already knew what he would see. It was a crude sketch of a young Apache girl with sharp eyes and long hair. Beneath it, the words, "Wanted for murder and escape. Dangerous. Reward, $50. He looked up slowly, meeting the lieutenant's hard gaze. "Can't say that I have." "You sure?" Graham pressed, leaning forward in his saddle. "Small, quiet, might be hurt. We have reason to believe she was cut down by someone passing near Cottonwood Flats." Calder held the paper a moment longer, then folded it neatly and handed it back. "Ain't seen a soul but jackrabbits and one stubborn cow." Lieutenant Graham's eyes narrowed. "She's not just some runaway, Wyatt. She's part of a violent band. Savages. That sign they left on the tree? They mean business." Calder's jaw tightened. "If I see her, I'll send word." The soldier stared at him, a long, calculating look, before finally giving a curt nod and turning his horse. "See that you do." Calder watched until the rider and his dust were gone. Inside, Lena stood just out of sight. She had heard it all. When he stepped back into the house, she was staring at him, her dark eyes unreadable. He took off his hat and set it on a peg by the door. "They're looking for you," he said, his voice flat. "Showed me a paper. Said you're wanted." She didn't move. "I told them I hadn't seen you." Her eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of confusion, of suspicion. "I don't know what you did, Lena," he said, turning to the cold stove. "And maybe you'll tell me someday. Maybe you won't. But out here, a man gets to make his own choices. I made mine." Behind him, she let out a small, quiet breath, and in that sound, the silence between them cracked just a little wider. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows as Calder sat on the porch, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone the only sound in the quiet yard. He was sharpening his knife, the repetitive motion a balm for his restless thoughts. He paused, his head cocked, the crunch of footsteps on gravel. Not a horse, not a coyote. Human. He looked up. Lena stood in the doorway. It was the first time she had stepped outside on her own. The blanket was draped over her shoulders like a ceremonial robe, her bare feet touching the earth as if testing its strength. She walked slowly, deliberately, to a patch of bare dirt near the barn, a place the wind kept swept clean. There, she knelt. Calder set his knife and stone aside. He rose and walked toward her, his steps quiet on the packed earth. He stopped a few feet away, giving her space. Her fingers found a small stick, and she began to draw in the dust. The lines were sure and sharp. Calder watched as an image took shape. A bird, its wings stretched wide in flight, but it was wreathed in flames. A burning corona. It was a creature of both agony and ascent, trying to escape the fire, or perhaps become it. He squatted beside her, his voice low. "What is that?" Lena didn't look up, her gaze fixed on her creation. A long moment passed before she spoke, her voice dry and raspy, like a riverbed in midsummer. "Bird in fire," she said. "The sign of my people." She tapped the center of the bird's chest. "My father's sign. We painted it on our lodges, carved it on our tools. Always flying, always in the fire." He could feel the tension radiating from her, the bracing for a blow that had already landed. "They came," she said, her voice halting. "Soldiers. Last spring. They said we had to move to a dry place. A place with no water, no game. They said we were a danger." The stick trembled in her hand. "We said no, this is our land. We would not leave." Her voice thinned to a whisper. "So they burned it. They burned everything. My mother, my brothers. They shot them. The old ones. They burned them in their lodges." Calder's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "I ran," she went on. "I hid. But they found me. They beat me and tied me. They called me a thief, said I stole a rifle. I did not." She finally turned, her eyes locking with his, and the whisper was gone, replaced by a low, simmering fury. "I did not steal. I did not kill. I did nothing." Her words hung in the still air, heavy as stone. Calder met her gaze. "I believe you," he said, his voice quiet but certain. She turned back to her drawing and let the stick fall from her fingers. Her shoulders began to shake, silent at first, then racked with raw, ragged sobs that seemed to tear their way out of her. She curled into herself, her hair falling around her like a dark curtain, the grief too large for her small frame. Calder didn't move to touch her, didn't offer empty words of comfort. Instead, he reached out and pressed his open palm flat against the earth, beside the drawing of the flaming bird. His skin against the dust she had shaped with her sorrow. It wasn't a touch. It was a testimony. Slowly, her breathing evened out. She lifted her head, her face streaked with tears and dirt. Their eyes met, unshielded now. "You can call me Lena," she whispered. Calder gave a small, grave nod. "All right then," he said, his voice like gravel and wind. "Lena it is." They sat there together as the sun bled out behind the ridge until the firebird in the dust was swallowed by the coming night. But its ashes, like the truth, remained. Later that evening, the wind sang a low, mournful tune through the rafters. Calder was tending a pot of beans over the stove while Lena stood by the window, watching the desert surrender to the darkness. The silence between them was no longer a wall, but a shared space. She turned from the window. "Do you want to know?" He looked up from the pot, spoon in hand, and nodded once. She came to the small table and sat across from him, her hands clasped before her. "My father was a chief," she began, her voice quiet but steady. "Our band was small. We wanted only peace. We traded with the settlers. We learned of their God. We lived by the rules they gave us." Calder listened, his expression unreadable. "A winter ago," she said, her knuckles turning white, "a white woman was found dead near our hunting grounds. Her husband blamed my people." Her eyes met his, dark and intense. "But he was the one who killed her. Everyone in the valley knew it. He drank and he had a cruel hand. But it was easier to blame us." She swallowed, the memory a physical thing in her throat. "The soldiers came, and with them ranchers, town men. They called it justice. They burned our camp while we slept. They shot my brothers as they ran from the flames. My mother died holding the prayer beads a priest had given her. And my father, they hung him from our own council pole." Calder closed his eyes for a brief second. "They found me hiding in a hollow log. I had a small knife for skinning. They took it and said it proved I was a killer. Then they took me to that tree, and they hung me up like bait." "Bait for who?" Calder asked, his voice a low scrape of sound. "For the rest of us," she said, her voice a low fire. "For anyone still alive and angry." She held his gaze, her own softening as she asked, "Why did you cut me down?" He watched her for a long moment, the campfire crackling in the space between them, casting flickering light on their faces. "Because once," he began, his voice catching. "I—" Her brow furrowed in question. "My family," Calder said, the words coming out flat and hollow. "Last spring, raiders swept through our ranch. They said it was Apache. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. I was out hunting. I came back to nothing but ashes." He stared into the flames, but saw a different fire. "My sister. She was 16. I heard her crying from the barn, but I was scared. I didn't go in. I just waited for help. She was gone before anyone came." The silence that followed was different. Not empty, but heavy with the weight of a ghost. "You saved me," Lena whispered, the realization dawning in her eyes. "Because you couldn't save her." He gave a slow, pained nod. She studied his face, the lines etched there by sun and sorrow. "If my skin had been white," she asked, her voice barely audible, "would you still have pulled the knife?" Calder rose slowly and walked around the table until he stood before her. She had to tilt her head back to look up at him, her eyes searching his. He reached down, cupping her chin in one hand. His fingers were calloused from work and weapons, but his touch was impossibly gentle. "I don't love skin," he said, his voice a low, gravelly hum. "I love the soul that breathes under it." Her eyes welled with tears that refused to fall. She reached up, taking his hand from her chin and pressing her cheek into his palm, closing her eyes at the contact. And then, as if pulled by an unspoken gravity, they leaned into each other. The kiss was quiet, hesitant at first, a question asked in darkness. Then it deepened, becoming a shared breath, as if both had been holding it for a lifetime and had finally remembered how to exhale. Her hands trembled where they rested on his chest. His arms circled her back, pulling her close. Behind them, the fire popped softly, a lone witness. Later they stood in the small kitchen, candlelight flickering against the old wooden beams. On the far wall, their shadows merged and moved as one. A slow, intimate dance they had never learned, but had always known. Outside, the desert wind, which had howled for days, finally fell silent. And inside, in the quiet space between two wounded hearts, something began to mend. The wind returned with the morning, harder than before, carrying the scent of sand and a faint, distant smoke. Calder felt a familiar tension in his bones, the shift in the air that came before a storm, even a storm that wore boots instead of clouds. 3 days had passed since the kiss. 3 days in which unspoken words had taken root in the quiet soil of the ranch. Lena moved with a new freedom, helping with the animals, sweeping the porch, her presence a soft hum in the lonely landscape. He'd even heard her laugh once, a quiet, silvery sound, when he'd cursed a stubborn mule. But the peace was a thin sheet of ice over deep water. By noon, a plume of dust rose from the east. Calder stood by the fence, his jaw tight, his rifle leaning against the porch post. 3 riders emerged from the haze, local men in canvas coats and worn hats, their own rifles slung across their backs. The one in the lead wore a tin badge that looked more claimed than earned. "Wyatt!" the man called out as he dismounted, his boots crunching on the dry earth. "Heard tell you might be harboring someone who don't belong here." Calder kept his voice steady. "You hear a lot of things, Joe. Doesn't make 'em true." Joe Prescott spat into the dirt, his eyes scanning the cabin. "A girl. Apache. There's a reward. $50 cash, and the gratitude of every God-fearing man west of the Pecos." "You rode all this way for a rumor?" Prescott's eyes narrowed into slits. "We aim to check inside, just to be sure." Calder stepped down from the porch, moving with a deliberate calm that was more dangerous than any threat. "You got a warrant for that?" Prescott snorted. "This ain't a courtroom, Wyatt." The other 2 men shifted in their saddles, their hands drifting near their weapons. The air grew brittle, ready to snap. "I'm the only one living here," Calder said, his voice like stone. "Ain't no girl, just ghosts and goats." Prescott held his stare for a long, tense moment, then gave a sharp, tight nod. "If you're lying," he warned, "you'll burn with her." They wheeled their horses and rode off without searching the house, but the message hung in the air like gun smoke. They would be back, with more men and less patience. That night, Calder sat by a small fire behind the barn, the stars obscured by a thick blanket of clouds. In his hand, he held the crude wooden sign he had dug up from where he'd buried it. The paint was faded, but the words were still there, still radiating a quiet hate. White man don't forgive. He stared at it, his fingers tracing the carved letters. Then he stood and carried it to the fire pit. There was no ceremony, no final speech. He simply laid it among the kindling and struck a match. The flames licked at the wood, then surged, swallowing the words in a dance of orange and gold. The board cracked and curled, as if the hatred it held was fighting its own demise. Footsteps on the dry grass behind him. Lina. She wore one of his old coats, far too large for her, the sleeves rolled up twice. She came to stand beside him, her gaze fixed on the fire. She didn't speak, but her presence was its own language. The flames danced in her dark eyes, reflecting both mourning and a flicker of freedom. "I should have burned it sooner," Calder said, his voice quiet. She didn't answer, but she moved closer, until her shoulder brushed against his. Her fingers knotted in the thick fabric of the coat. "Thank you," she said. So softly, the words were almost lost to the crackle of the fire. They were simple words, but they landed with the weight of a prayer. He looked down at her, his heart a heavy living thing in his chest. As the fire burned down to glowing embers, the wind above them slowed to a hush. And for the first time since he cut her down from that tree, there was no sign left of the judgment that had been written against her. There was only heat and smoke, and the profound weight of the choice they had made instead. The next morning brought no wind, only a thick, unnatural stillness. Calder rose before dawn, packing dried biscuits, jerky, and a full canteen into a saddlebag. The very air around the ranch felt tight, as if being watched. He had seen smoke on the horizon, too steady for a campfire. Word had spread. Their time had run out. Lina stood by the fence line, her dark hair braided back, her small frame wrapped in the same coat from the night before. Her face was calm, but her eyes were full of questions. "We have to go," Calder said, cinching the final strap on his pack. "Tonight." She nodded. She already knew. "There's land south of here," he continued, his voice low. "Across the border. Some say the Apache still live free in the Sierra Madres. Far from soldiers, far from signs." He paused, his gaze meeting hers. "We can make it, if we ride hard." Lina stepped closer, so close he could see the faint flush of the morning light on her cheeks. She reached out and took his hand, her grip firm and sure. He looked down at their joined hands, then back at her face. "You'll come with me?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. She pressed her forehead against his chest, her breath a warm spot through his shirt. And then she answered him in the soft, flowing syllables of the Apache tongue. "I want to live," she said, slow and clear. "I want to live as your wife." Calder closed his eyes. That one sentence held more weight than 1,000 vows. He bent his head and kissed the crown of her hair, breathing in her scent, as if it were the only thing keeping him tethered to the earth. By sundown, they were ready. 2 horses, saddled and silent. The ranch was left behind them. No note, no lingering fire. no goodbye. Just a quiet door, left to swing in the evening breeze, and a home that was already a memory. They rode through the desert under a blanket of stars, moonlight painting the ridges in shades of silver. Lena rode with a steady, practiced grace, her eyes on the path ahead. She did not ask where they were going, or what they might find. She only followed. 10 miles from the border, the land opened into a plain of low scrub brush and jagged stone cliffs. Calder scanned the horizon relentlessly, every shadow a potential threat. His gut twisted into a knot. Then the shot came, a sharp crack that echoed across the vast emptiness. Calder jerked in the saddle, a grunt of pain torn from his throat, and then he was falling, sliding hard into the dust. "Calder!" Lena's scream ripped through the night as she leaped from her horse. He clutched his side, blood already seeping through his fingers, dark against his shirt. "Keep going," he rasped, his voice strained. "Go." Another shot whizzed past them, sparking off a rock behind her head. On the ridgeline above, two figures on horseback appeared, silhouettes with rifles raised. Calder groaned, pushing himself up on one elbow. "We have to move." Lena hooked an arm under his shoulder, pulling with all her strength. "Believe me," he growled through clenched teeth, "I won't die here." Fueled by sheer will, they stumbled toward the rocks, bullets kicking up dust around their feet. Calder's boots dragged, but he forced one step after another, each breath a wet, ragged sound. His vision blurred at the edges. Somehow, they reached a narrow gap between two cliffs, a hidden pass shrouded in shadow. Lena half dragged, half carried him inside, pressing him against the cool stone wall, her own chest heaving for air. Behind them, the shooting stopped. The riders wouldn't follow them into the tight passage on horseback. They would lose their advantage. In the deep shadow of the pass, Calder collapsed to his knees, his blood dripping onto the thirsty ground. He looked up at her, his eyes a mixture of agony and awe. "You said you wanted to be my wife." She knelt beside him, her hands cupping his face, her touch a desperate anchor. "I meant it." A faint smile touched his lips, a ghost of what it had been. "Then we better make it through this pass." She nodded, and for the first time since they met, Lena prayed. Not to the white man's God, but to the ancient spirits of fire, wind, and survival. Because love in a land like this was always a gamble, and tonight they were betting everything they had. The tent flaps rustled in the river breeze, allowing slivers of moonlight to fall like silver threads across the floor. Outside, crickets sang their nightly chorus, and the water whispered over smooth stones. Inside, Calder lay propped on a bed of folded blankets, his breathing slow and steady. The fever had broken. The worst was over. Lena sat beside him, a basin of cool water at her side, a damp cloth in her hand. She gently wiped his brow, her movements deft and soothing. He watched her through half-lidded eyes, the corners of his mouth lifting in a weak smile. "You always this bossy with your patience?" he murmured. She raised an eyebrow, but a true smile touched her own lips. "Only the ones too stubborn to die." He let out a low chuckle, then winced as the movement pulled at the fresh stitches in his side. She hushed him gently, placing a palm over his heart to still him. The silence that settled between them was not awkward, but full, a comfortable weight. As the wind sighed outside, he spoke again, his voice softer now, stripped of its usual armor. "Tell me something true," he said. "What's your real name?" Lena looked down, a flicker of hesitation in her eyes. Then she took his hand and guided it to her chest, placing it just over her heart. Ayana, she said, the name a soft current in the quiet tent. It means peaceful river. My father gave it to me. Calder closed his eyes for a moment, letting the name settle over him like a blessing. When he opened them again, a deep warmth had replaced the weariness. Ayana, he repeated, tasting the word. You're the only peace I've ever known. This time she did not cry. She only held his hand tighter. Months passed. On the southern edge of the territory, where the border was a blurred line of mesquite groves and dry wind, a small lodge stood near a bend in the river. It was made of pine and hide, strong but humble, nestled among whispering reeds and stubborn wildflowers. In the shade of its small porch, Ayana Salvatierra sat cross-legged, stitching a tiny white shirt. Her belly had grown round and full, a gentle curve beneath her woven sash. Humming a quiet tune, she worked the needle through the soft cotton, her fingers sure and calm. Beyond the small garden she tended, Calder was training a young Mustang, his low commands both patient and firm. Every so often, he would glance back at the lodge, at the silhouette of his wife through the thin curtain, and every time, he smiled. Their home held no trophies, no faded portraits, just bundles of drying herbs hanging from the rafters, 2 worn books on a shelf, and a child's blanket, waiting to be finished. Ayana moved through the space like its breath, present, grounding, and full of life. One evening, as the sun bled color into the western sky, she walked down to the river along the path worn smooth by her own feet. The current moved with a slow certainty. She stepped barefoot into the shallows, letting the cool water swirl around her ankles, and placed both hands over her belly. Little one, she whispered to the life within her, her voice carried on the breeze. Your father, he didn't just forgive, he loved, and he kept his promise, every single one. Footsteps padded across the soft earth behind her. Calder came to stand at her side, their fingers finding each other and lacing together without a word. Together, they watched the river drift toward the dusk as the first stars began to blink into view. No one would ever write down their story. No one would know how 2 hunted souls had found each other in a world of scars and storms. But here, in this quiet patch of earth they called home, they had created a life. Not the kind found in history books, but the kind that endures, fierce and gentle and true. And the river kept flowing, peaceful as her name, endless as their love, carrying them finally, truly home. If this story moved your heart, if it reminded you that even in the harshest of deserts, love can bloom like a river from stone, then you have found your tribe. Subscribe to Wild West Love Stories for more tales of forbidden romance, quiet bravery, and a love that defies time, blood, and boundaries. From dusty trails to whispered promises, every story is crafted to stay with you, long after the final word is spoken. Where bullets missed, but hearts never did. Subscribe now and never miss a heartbeat from the heart of the Wild West.